I'd like to welcome all of you to the second day of the 22nd World Science Fiction Convention, Pacificon. Very few of you need to be introduced to. Fritz Leiber, who is probably one of the most distinguished men, both in appearance and in talent, in the monster field, at any rate, will speak to us on the subject as noted in your program book, with his own personal title of Monsters and Monster Lovers. Fritz.
This talk begins on a Hotel Leamington laundry list, and only the reputedly higher powers which gropingly attempt to guide this mystery-ridden, in fact, mystery-stampeded universe know where it may carry us. For mystery is the subject of my story. Mystery and monsters. Now, I like monsters. In fact, I love monsters. I mean fictional monsters created by artists of the typewriter. Monsters such as Frankenstein's, that much misunderstood, humble patchwork of humanity, seeker after truth and lover of little children. Yog-Sothoth, H.P. Lovecraft's somewhat gloomy vision of the ultimate God of gods, an inordinately fat, pustulant, and churned-up being with the mind, or rather the mindlessness, of an idiot whose only joy is listening 24 hours a day to flute music with a little piccolo thrown in. Also among the monsters I love, Mr. Hyde, that vastly more interesting, uninhibited, hip, fun-loving, and healthily dynamic alter ego of the pusillanimous, square Dr. Jekyll. Helen Vaughan, Arthur Macken's girl counterpart of Mr. Hyde, a she-satyr, sneaking through the novella The Great God Pan, and who led innumerable men to highly colorful dooms, which, if they ended in primordial slime, at least began and long continued through episodes of delightfully abnormal ecstasies. Alraune, Hans Heinz Evers' Miss Hyde, born of a modern love goddess and the last seed of a hanged murderer, who did exactly the same things as Helen Vaughan did, with the attractive additions of a slim, boyish figure and a German accent. Charles Dexter Ward, Lovecraft's own projection of himself, a mild-mannered, bookish, and reserved young New Englander, whose only crime was that he wanted to carry communication, a word worshipped by sociologists, educators, ad men, and I imagine most of us here, to carry communication a mite too far for the weak-stomached, police-minded, and puerile by raising the dead from their essential salts. Not for any wishy-washy, sentimental reasons, but simply to talk to them endlessly about themselves and all the things they ever knew. Incidentally, we now shift to Hotel Leamington Stationery. Continuing among the monsters I love, the great Boig, that living midnight forest darker than Muir Woods, who played an endless game of hide-and-seek with Henrik Ibsen's Peer Gynt. Then, shifting a bit toward science fiction, there's Ku'er, the intelligent emperor of all Black Panthers, who stalked through Van Vogt's Black Destroyer, and whose only food, at least in the first magazine version, was a most mysterious substance which deep Freudian searchers may just be able to identify, since it was called id. Duke Ferdinand, from the play The Duchess of Malfi, by Shakespeare's Jacobean contemporary John Webster. Duke Ferdinand, the great-granddaddy of all Wolfmen, who loved his sister just a little too much, and who growled and clawed up graves in jolly old Renaissance Italy, and uttered such a memorable death line as, "I do account this world but a dog kennel. I will vault credit and affect high pleasures after death." Svengali, Trilby's highly talented but much unappreciated voice teacher and agent manager. Quasimodo, Victor Hugo's deathless hunchback, who will shamble soulfully on forever, loving all humanity, but especially Esmeralda, occasionally tossing a roof tile our way, stalking amongst the gargoyles and chimeras of Notre Dame. And finally, King Kong, or Kong King, as he was called in Swedish, Poul Anderson tells me. Another vastly misunderstood devotee of beauty, who was simply too big, both in soul and body, for this crassly commercial world, who did his best to get rid of the metropolitan blight that is Manhattan. And who wanted simply to be as respectfully tender as possible to Fay Wray. Do you remember, dear audience, the gesture of infinite and adoring care with which he laid her on a roof ledge of the Empire State Building before he turned defiantly to meet the evil machine gun attack of those 4 accursed biplanes? Yes, I love monsters. They have, all of them, at times scared me breathless. And even now, although they are numbered among my dearest and best understood friends, along with Robert Bloch, the Judy Merrill who wrote Only a Mother, Ed Hamilton of The Spider God of Mamirth, and Lee Brackett of that lovely Catwoman story, they, the monsters, can still give me a friendly chill every now and then, very much as a girl might give me a friendly kiss, though not as often as I'd like, on a dark, lonely evening when my mind is free. And now we'll shift in a moment to good yellow second sheets, the most dependable road for any writer. Yes, I love monsters. Monsters from Seal Lolly's Fantastic and all the rest of them. Other people may prefer axe murderers, Nazi sadists, or Nazi sadists, as Churchill would have called them, prize fighters, bullfighters or bulls, lions or tigers burning bright in the jungle or on the veldt, juvenile delinquents with switchblades and bicycle chains and Russian slang, successful monomaniac career women, and, I must in all fairness add, successful monomaniac career men, first-wave Marines, gangsters, hanging judges, Hungarian atomic scientists whooping it up for the H-bomb, or homicidal maniacs with razor-keen butcher knives. Realism always has its devotees. But I prefer the more romantic figures, friendlier to me, of the Phantom of the Opera, another misunderstood voice teacher, just like Svengali, and a misunderstood bringer of success to young ladies, a man who made the sewers of Paris more livable, even lavishly so, and Count Dracula, who fed not only on the blood of beautiful young ladies, but also on that of his theatric interpreter, Bela Lugosi, who reached out to establish an erudite fan club 3 years after his death. Continuing among the monsters I love, Cthulhu, who broadcast thrilling dreams in Lovecraft's story to a bored humanity and made the Pacific Ocean a less lonely place. Nyarlathotep, Lovecraft's dark, modern pharaoh magician, come out of Egypt, far handsomer than Victor Mature or Sharif, and even more able to shock and confound society than Robert Bloch or Harlan Ellison. The Wolfman, Duke Ferdinand's or any other lusty, satyrish old werewolf with the exotic para-equipment glamorizing by contrast of top hat and white tie and tails evening clothes. The White Devil, John Webster's feminine counterpart of Duke Ferdinand, lovely as a white Russian bitch wolfhound with hydrophobia. The Red Brain, Donald Wandry's end-of-the-world creation, who was much more intriguingly colorful and apparently leftist, and who spun so much faster than his square gray comrades. It, whom Ted Sturgeon sent shambling forever across forest and countryside, scattering the dead leaves every bit as effectively as Shelley's West Wind. Archimago, the arch-magician who lurks behind the murmurous poetry of Spenser's The Faerie Queene, the prototype of all nasty old queen-kidnapping, princess-hungry, and Fanta-enticing black magicians. Hugo's the man who laughs, who, by keeping a very stiff upper lip, you see, he had been, in childhood, he had had his face operated on in the crude surgery of the underworld of James II, so that it was distorted into a perpetual smile, grimace, grin, and only by a supreme effort of will could he straighten out this smile and make his face stern, though horrible. But at any rate, the man who laughs, who by keeping a very stiff upper lip, delivered to the Parliament of King James II a proto-Marxist and humanitarian address far more devastating than any pronouncement by Bertrand Russell or Sir Stafford Cripps. And finally, the Mummy, whose only misdeed was that he wanted immortality to be a reality rather than a fiction, and who was willing to work and unwind endlessly for it. More or less historical personages, such as Caligula, Gilles de Rais, Jack the Ripper, Harold Bluetooth, Blackbeard the Pirate, Cesar Borgia, Saul, Stalin, Torquemada, Calvin, the late Senator McCarthy, and General MacArthur seem to me, these monsters seem to me to fall into a class midway between the real and the fictional. Something of the same sort feels true of the greatest tormented hero villains of literature. But since this little talk about the beings I love is largely concerned with classification and generalizations, we must expect to find intermediate groupings, exceptions, interclasses, means and extremes, qualifications and conditions. So I'd better get down to definitions right away and give the essence of the creature under discussion. A monster is a symbol of the secret and the powerful, the dangerous and the unknown, arousing dread and curiosity, and also exaltation and frightened laughter. An old geographer looks at the large blank spaces of his finished map and inks in, "Here be monsters." perhaps his imagination is stirred, and he draws a little picture of something. A Lovecraft peoples with monsters, alien planets, and dimensions. A Poe lifts from the equally unbounded darkness of the human mind a William Wilson, a Metzengerstein, a Roderick Usher, a man of the crowd, and an imp of the perverse. A symbol of the sort I am talking about, monster as symbol, has 1,000 meanings and more. So a monster, symbolizing that about which we can only speculate and wonder, is a master symbol, suggesting the remotest mysteries of nature and human nature, the most dimly sensed secrets of space, time, and the hidden regions of the mind. Innumerable uncertain meanings lurk like will-o'-the-wisps behind the dusty, seamed, and pleated mask and milkily veiled eyes of Frankenstein's monster, or the three-lobed flaming orb of the haunter of the dark. And Arthur Machen expresses his reactions to industrial London in terms of murderous Pictish troglodytes skulking about its environs in modern times. And he also creates Helen Vaughan in The Great God Pan as a guise for 1,000 mysterious speculations in the direction of violence, sadism and masochism, sex, and evolutionary theory. The face of the noseless, dome-foreheaded, cavern-eyed, fang-toothed Eric of the Phantom of the Opera is simply every man's knowledge of the killer and rapist and torturer inside him, the God who demands worship and infinite solace, the imposter dreading and perhaps at the deepest level hoping that someone will lift his love mask with which he disguises himself to the world and especially to his friends and loved ones, and discover the hateful truth of his real face. Someone like E.E. Smith dreams his prophetic dreams of fascism and man's boundless ego in terms of a Boscone, a Helmuth, an overlord of Delgon. And Oscar Wilde writes of the crueler aspects of the art of life and of the darker side of his homosexuality in terms of a Dorian Gray. Stevenson extrapolates from alcoholism to Mr. Hyde. In short, living monsters are full charged with a tingling energy of meaning. As a child, I didn't have to be told they were as dangerous to the touch as a high-tension wire. Dead monsters, however, reduced to husks or masks of themselves, are another matter, which we'll take up later. Monsters are door breakers, space eaters. That's from Frank Belknap Long. They have power beyond their energy of meaning. They are gigantic in one way or another. They are destroyers of bodies and minds and cities and planets. Monsters are shape changers, too. A man turned to a wolf or a bat. The dead come alive, carrion shocked into pulsing flesh. Or Helen Vaughan becomes slime. Charles Dexter Ward returned to dust. At the alien extreme, there are Lovecraft's amorphous shuggoths, their protoplasm molded by hypnotic suggestion, and also there's the man counterfeiting being from a bluer sun in John Campbell's Who Goes There? Closest to home, perhaps, we have Jekyll and Hyde again, a byword for the basic shape change. Practically all monsters are fundamentally schizoid, symbolizing on the subjective frontier evil, aggression, original sin, the unconscious, the id, as various people have named it, the death wish, the animus or anima, and the shadow. Monsters are also deviants, mutant mules, the only one of their kind, symbols of uniqueness and identity, supreme embodiments of individualism, and most of them are crippled or disfigured in some way, if not physically or even mentally, then at least by Earth's environment, which is hostile to them. It is not surprising that the rejected or different child should be tempted to put on the mask of the monster. The way of all ways to impress and control and very often delight others is to scare them. In Look Homeward, Angel, Thomas Wolfe gives a vivid picture of a child experiencing a sense of power by identification with green-visaged, ghoulish riders of the night wind. Men are old hands at putting on monster masks. More of that later on. It's likewise appropriate that the chief collection of Lovecraft's writings should take its title from his short story, The Outsider, where, after the fashion of the Red Death of Poe's, a lonely ghoul routs a household of merry-making normals and so comes to a full realization of his own abnormality. This vivid picture of the confrontation of the conforming crowd by the single deviant, inner-directed individual points up one of the chief trends in fantasy writing during the last 3 decades, the compulsion to understand the monster. This trend is one of the marks of the transition from supernatural horror to science fiction and appears most clearly in the contrast between the extraterrestrial beings of Lovecraft and those, say, of Weinbaum or Heinlein or Smith, with the monsters of Van Vogt somewhere in between. You can even say that one writer sets a problem by creating a monster. Then another writer may attempt to solve the problem by explaining the monster, sometimes by speculations about the physics and chemistry of alien planets, and sometimes by showing us that what the first writer has or may have projected into his creation from himself and from the world. This process is crucial in the growth pattern and life history of monsters in the realm of art. One of the clearest indications that the monster symbolizes the deviant individual is the frequency with which he appears in the guise of scapegoat. First mocked, then feared, and finally destroyed by the mob. The pursuit of the monster through the night by a torch-bearing pack of peasants or proletariat has become a traditional closing phase of many horror movies, additionally suggesting that the monster may symbolize the aristocrat hunted down by the revolutionary mob, in any case the individual opposed to the mob. But the mockery is perhaps the most interesting ingredient. The man who laughs, prototype of the phantom, must himself first be laughed at before he can, by a supreme effort of will, as I mentioned before, fix his features in the fright mask that is his only alternative to appearing ridiculous. H.G. Wells understood this aspect of the monster most sympathetically and gives us an unforgettable picture of it in his Invisible Man, as he changes from a figure of voyeuristic and magic might into a pitiable fugitive, his very power become the peculiarity that marks him down for pursuit and destruction. Monsters are modeled on creatures of primitive folklore and religious legend. The werewolf, the vampire, the ghoul, the golem, the devil, the demon, the incubus and succubus, the zombie, the ghost. And here it must never be forgotten that during most of man's history, such creatures were generally believed in, except for the handful of wise or cynical skeptics who have probably existed in all ages, and they were regularly and seriously invoked by some individuals to control others. The priest made use of the devil, grandmother of the bogeyman, the cluxer of the hant. The witch doctor's power is a byword, and the proto-monster is one of the masks of authority. Such creatures of folklore and legend collectively come close to constituting the whole of superstition, a malign and reactionary force, the hold of which on the human mind has only been broken by generations of bold propagandizing for science and humanism. So you see, the artist who creates monsters from the raw material of such folk creatures should realize that he is undertaking something that will appear dubious to many. He knows that he is trying only to design an artistic symbol and give his audience a harmless thrill of fear, asking not for belief, but merely for momentary suspension of disbelief. However, many of his sober-minded and perhaps less imaginative critics will feel that he's simply trying to create a new superstition or refurbish an old one, and that he's deliberately playing on and re-stimulating some of mankind's most deep-rooted and debasing dreads. The victory of science over superstition is new and by no means complete, and there is a real sense in which the artist specializing in tales of supernatural horror is merely playing with emotions left over in man from less skeptical and sophisticated eras. So, such an artist mustn't be surprised if he meets with criticism, or if members of his audience suddenly rise and with a surprisingly great enthusiasm begin to debunk his monsters, from the child who never stops explaining how the movie dinosaurs are really tiny models, to the intellectual who has a psychoanalytic theory of the vampire and of the author who writes about him. It's both easy and gratifying to step into the shoes of Thomas Huxley or Robert Ingersoll. Besides that, there's a little real scare left in monsters, and it is still necessary for people to rationalize them away again from time to time. They would hardly sleep easily otherwise. Artists, particularly fantasy artists, writers I mean, outsiders themselves in one or more ways, are apt to be the only true friends monsters ever have, understanding them too well ever to turn on them. Robert Bloch and Ray Bradbury are notable examples. One thinks of the many Bloch stories in which the monster successfully asserts his genius and triumphs over his victim, whether a man or a city, or the typical Bradbury tale in which a technology-worshipping culture that has supposedly been disinfected of all criminally imaginative taints is invaded and destroyed by some eldritch being of myth, who is presented as sympathetically by Bradbury as in as homey a light as that of Booth Tarkington. Monsters have a longer or shorter lifetime in the realm of art and in the minds of the individual members of their audience. Newly created monsters, as we have seen, are electric with mystery and rich in implications. But monsters age and die. They invite understanding and they perish when they get it. The blank spaces on the map fill up with names and distances. The unknown, of which the monster is a symbol, gradually becomes the known, or at least the speculatively well explored. The investigations of psychoanalysts are rounded out, widely disseminated, and even popularized in various simplified versions. The atom's power is unlocked, and the Sunday supplement tells you how. Old taboos are lifted. Alcoholism, cancer, and syphilis become respectable or at least mentionable diseases. Rockets pierce the stratosphere and orbit in space. It becomes commonly accepted that the universe contains trillions of planets teeming with alien life forms, and engineering institutions like MIT limber up students' minds by having them design dwellings, furnishings, and vehicles adapted to specific, hypothetical, non-human life forms and unearthly environments. The monster, whether he's Mr. Hyde or Yog-Sothoth, becomes an empty husk or mask because enough, though by no means all, of what he symbolizes has been satisfactorily identified. People can point to him and to their former fear of him and say such things as death wish, nitrogen breather, anima, copper-blooded, castration complex, anti-gravity, with all the effect of an exorcism by cross, prayer, and holy water. Unsympathetic over-exploitation hastens the death of monsters. At best, a monster is like a cat. He has only so many lives in him. Each appearance he makes permanently robs him of a little of his power. Competent writers of horror stories know this very well and practice judicious restraint in their tales, carefully building a menacing atmosphere to prepare the reader, next allowing him to glimpse the monster, finally permitting him only at most one full view or one sequence with the monster in full view. Even motion pictures at one time followed this formula, judging from the Phantom of the Opera. But with repeated appearances, the monster comes more and more to be handled as a stage prop that can be whisked on and off the setting at will and shaken repeatedly, like Punch, Judy, or Jack Ketch, in the faces of the audience. Of course, when the monster is finally truly dead, meaning when he dies completely as a symbol, then his remains can be handled, shown around, and mocked with complete impunity. And almost needless to say, he can be fictionally revived, quite dead in spirit, from any number of lava baths, atomic explosions, and entombments in the vacuum of interstellar space. Indeed, the husks or masks of monsters are very safe to jeer at and highly suitable for a more or less sinister sort of play. A witty person can put on such a mask, either figuratively or literally, and perhaps throw a momentary scare into his little brother or girlfriend, or at least surely evoke the admiring guffaws of some of his less enterprising companions. Dracula and Frankenstein, in unexpected or grotesque situations, become the subject of endless cartoons. Purely farcical stories featuring households of monsters are written. Entire magazines can be composed of the pictures of artistically dead monsters with suitable wisecracking captions. Much laughter can be evoked by replacing the clean-cut young man of the advertisements with a dead monster, preferably in an advanced stage of decay. Fun magazines like Mad flourish, featuring the humor of the grotesque, the violent, and the monstrous. Sometimes such humor is even truly satirical. One must admit that the fanged and shock-headed carrion monster is a delightful counterfigure to the pearly-toothed, eternally glowing, stridently healthy princess of the billboards. Beyond that, monsters have become background material for a growing cult of ugliness, where the key question is, what's the most disgusting thing you can think of? It was by no means by chance that when Al Capp solicited his readers to draw pictures of the most ugly face they could imagine that he got an enthusiastic response. There was a time when the monster had a certain sinister beauty, but the ugliness cult seems to be interested in nothing but guffaws. The more of a lout the monster is, the better they like it. However, it's futile for the monster lover to become indignant or at the degraded use to which some of his favorite fictional personages are put. He can remind himself that, on the best interpretation, the mockers of monsters are simply reenacting the old assault of scientific skepticism on superstition. Of course, on the worst interpretation, they are mocking the deviant, the cripple, and the exceptional individual under cover of mocking the monster. But perhaps the less thought about that interpretation, the better, at least for the moment. People have always liked to wear the masks of monsters, as shown by such festivals as Halloween, Mardi Gras, and Fasching. Such masks can be used defensively as well as offensively, and there is certainly a touch of the monster in the cold collective face masked by black-lensed glasses which the hipsters, hepcats, and so-called beatniks turn on the world. In the realm of weed and cool sound, the mask of the black magician is the obvious one to wear. Ages, eras, times of optimism, civil liberty, and peace, at least for the artist and his audience, appear to be most favorable to the healthy growth of richly symbolic monsters. Secure times, when law and order seem to rule and life appears to conform to familiar habits and traditions, provide an effective setting for the monster, just as they do for the classic British detective story, where the general security is disturbed only to be reestablished more firmly with the detection and capture of the criminal. During such times, too, the average person's more primal fears slumber most of the time. The business of daily living rarely calls them forth. It takes the artist to rouse and exercise and perhaps exorcise them. The late 19th century and early 20th century were the times of such masters as Mackin, Dunsany, Blackwood, Montague Rhodes James, Stoker, Haggard, Wilde, Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, and other masters of the monster story. Now, on the other side, conversely, periods of war, insecurity, police tyranny, and immediate peril to the individual and his self-respect seem much less favorable to the creation and appreciation of monsters in the artistic realms, though we must remember that then all art suffers. Such periods may provide excellent fictional settings for monsters, as witness Guy Endor's The Werewolf of Paris and various horror stories revolving around that and other French revolutions. And they certainly furnish much potential raw material for monster stories. But supernatural terror is thin fare for people fearing a more material knock at the door, and a death that drops from the air, shrieking in steel-cased bombs, rather than fluttering on the wings of a shape-changing bat. Psychiatrists who were there report that neurosis practically disappeared in Europe under the Nazi terror, although psychosis claimed quite as many victims as ever. Similarly, monster stories, no matter how subtle and rich their symbolism, will hardly appeal as a bedtime tidbit to people who have supped full of horrors. During times of total war, also, some men become monsters, and physical horror may not only swallow up supernatural terror, but seek to engulf the whole world of the spirit and the flesh. The Nazi concentration camps reproduced in literal fact much of the situations and paraphernalia of the more lurid horror story. There the questions, what's the most disgusting thing you can think of and what's the worst torture you can imagine, became more than academic. Those in charge not only wore the masks of monsters, but sought to force their victims to wear them too. Starvation, torture, and a killing but unpredictable discipline were systematically imposed with the object of turning men and women into spiritless beasts. A cult of the humor of the degraded and the grotesque, not unrelated to our current ugliness cult, grew up and flourished. The more unsuitable the clothing allotted to the prisoners, the more senseless the tasks imposed on them, the more impossible the choices forced upon them, then the wittier the amusement was deemed to be. There the drama of the monster as scapegoat was daily reenacted, the shambling and twitching beast man surrounded by his mockers and tormentors. There, deviation, whether it derived from a person being a Jew, a gypsy, or a social democrat, or merely a thinker, or sometimes just even an eccentric, received its ultimate punishment, as it did in the days of the witch cult and the Inquisition. Finally, are artistic monsters gone for good and all? Considering the degree to which they have been explained, exploited, ridiculed, and degraded, one would hardly be surprised. Or put the question another way, will science fiction completely replace the story of supernatural terror? Though plausible at first sight, this seems most unlikely. Raw material for the creation of novel monsters is pouring in on the artist as never before. Many of the most typical creations of science fiction, especially the robot, the android, and the extraterrestrial, are simply the monster in a new guise. The Superman is nothing more than the monster in a bright light. just as the monster is nothing more than the Superman in shadow. The chances are that the monster as an artistic creation will live as long as fear and the unconscious mind and man's multiple selves. More exacting work will be demanded of the artist, especially in locating the sensitive shadow sectors of the mind in the face of the master rationalization science knows and various hidden persuaders that all is securely in the hands of experts. But whenever the artist finds those sensitive sectors, he will be able to work his old creative magic. He will have to undertake new pioneering explorations of man's spirit, but in so doing he will find the gaps in the walls of the new knowledge. For so long as man progresses, the area of the unknown will continue to grow, both inside and outside the mind. And wherever the unknown is, there will be monsters.
I'm sure you'll all agree that that was truly one of the memorable speeches in a convention. Now you know why all convention committees call on Fritz Leiber to give a speech. Again, I would like to express on behalf of the Pacificon 2 committee my deep appreciation for Fritz's wonderful speech there. And Fritz, go down to the bar now and get yourself refreshed, and would you send Tony up here?